What's happening right now in Hat Yai is just staggering. The city in southern Thailand is underwater. And look, this isn't just another flood. We're hearing it called a 3-century catastrophe. So today we're going to dive in and really unpack how an event of this magnitude can happen in a modern city and what it all means when our defenses are just completely overwhelmed. Okay, so the first thing you have to wrap your head around is the sheer scale of this. Officials are on the record calling this the most severe flood in 300 years. Think about that. It's an event that is completely beyond living memory. No one alive has seen anything like it. And that single fact, well, it sets the stage for this entire crisis. All right, so here's how we're going to break it all down. First, we'll look at just how historic this flood really was. Then we'll get into the anatomy of the disaster. What were the root causes? After that, we'll tackle the big problem. Why is the water just stuck there? And finally, we'll look at the long road ahead, the timeline to get back to something like normal. Okay, let's jump right into part one, a flood for the centuries. You know, it's easy to call this a big storm, but it was something else entirely. This was an event that literally rewrote the history books for this entire region. So as the reports were coming in, the situation on the ground wasn't just bad, it was actively getting worse by the hour. Even after the heaviest rain finally stopped, a massive volume of water just kept pouring into the city, overwhelming everything. This wasn't a quick flash flood, not at all. It was a slow-motion inundation, just swallowing the economic heart of Hat Yai. All right, that brings us to part two, the anatomy of a disaster. So the big question is, how? How did this happen? Let's unpack the root causes. I mean, it's the most fundamental question, isn't it? How could this much water possibly be unleashed on a modern city? And the answer? Well, it isn't a single culprit. It's a devastating combination of factors, a perfect storm of both nature and geography. It really boils down to two main drivers. First, you had a meteorological perfect storm, a super intense monsoon trough collided with a low-pressure cell, creating a weather event of truly historic proportions. And second, there's a geographical vulnerability. You see, Hat Yai is built in a natural funnel, a low-lying basin that inevitably collects water from all the surrounding high ground. And just look at this number, 335 millimeters. That is over a foot of rain in a single 24-hour period. Let that sink in. To put that in perspective, this wasn't just a record. It was the single heaviest day of rainfall the region has seen in 300 years. This was an event completely outside the scope of modern memory or any kind of planning. This chart really puts the scale of the disaster in sharp relief. The last major record flood was back in 2010. They got 428 millimeters over 3 days, and that was considered a massive event at the time. Well, this 2025 flood completely dwarfed it, dumping 630 millimeters in the same time frame. It wasn't just a little worse. This was an entirely different category of disaster. So to really get this, you have to understand the geography. Think of Hat Yai as a giant bowl. All the rain that falls on the surrounding mountains and hills all flows downhill. Every stream, every river funnels that water directly towards one single place, the Khlong Phuminat Canal, which runs right through the heart of the city. And that brings us right to our third section, the Great Drainage Standoff. Because you see, it's one thing for the water to arrive. It's a whole other problem for it to refuse to leave. And this is where the crisis truly took hold. I mean, this is the question that must have been on everyone's mind in the city. The sky is finally clear, the main downpour is over, so why are the streets still rivers? Why is the water level not dropping? It had to be maddening. The answer is a three-part problem. First, the city's main artery, the Khlong Phuminat Canal, was so overwhelmed it just spilled its banks and poured into the city. Second, and this is so critical, even after the rain stopped in Hat Yai, runoff from earlier downpours in the upland areas was still rushing downstream, constantly feeding the flood. And third, because the city sits so low, the water is in a total gridlock. It has nowhere to go and has to be painstakingly pumped out. And this is a critical point. Hat Yai has modern flood defenses. It has a massive drainage canal, the Khlong Phuminat Damri, built specifically to divert floodwater away from the city. But this event was so extreme, the volume of water was simply greater than what the system was ever designed to handle. The city's shield was breached because the storm was bigger than anyone had ever planned for. Okay, on to our final section, timeline to normalcy. With the city submerged, the focus now has to shift to the long, difficult road to recovery. This is the most important question for residents and for the whole nation, really. When can people go home? When can businesses reopen? How long until the city feels like itself again? The answer, as you might expect, is not simple. So the recovery is planned in phases, and each one is a massive undertaking. The very first step is just getting the water out of the main commercial zones, a process that's projected to last into early December. Only then can the focus shift to restoring basic services like power and water. And then, if all goes well, a semblance of economic normalcy, with businesses in tourism returning, is hoped for by the middle to the end of December. But we have to temper that official timeline with a dose of hard reality. An expert assessment from the height of the crisis warned that the city's main economic engine, its central business zone, would likely stay underwater until at least the middle of December. This just highlights the immense challenge of draining such a vast quantity of trapped water. And this brings us to a final, pretty sobering thought. The entire recovery plan is aimed at a return to normal. But after an event that shatters all modern records, one that was literally off the charts, it forces us to ask a much bigger question. When a 300-year event actually happens, what does normal even mean anymore?